Okay, so when we're also making management decisions, we like to look at the cost of goods sold model. The way this computation works, it's a very common formula that is used. Beginning inventory, this is what we start off. We're going to add purchases to it. And when we do that, we'll end up with the cost of goods available for sales. So that's 1,200 plus the 6,300 means we have 7,500 available. We can then subtract our ending inventory, and in subtracting our ending inventory, we are left with that which had to have been sold. And that is, in this example here, $6,000. So we had 7,500 that was available for sale. We had ending inventory that was 1,500. The difference between those two numbers had to have been sold. So we can compute what the cost of goods sold is. Now, in many cases, we can rearrange this number. We can rearrange this number if we're missing something. So for example, let's say we're missing purchases and we're trying to figure out what the purchases are. But however, we know what the cost of goods sold is. So if we start off with the cost of goods sold, we can think, okay, wait a minute. If I add the ending inventory, to it, then I'm going to end up with the goods available for sale as what was planned of 7,500. Now all I need to know is the beginning inventory, and we can compute what our purchases should be. Now this is a model that would be used if you're trying to budget for purchases. You know what you can compute what your cost of goods sold is, and you do that based upon sales and what you think your cost is going to be. So you can compute that. You can put what you want your ending inventory to be. You could put what the goods available for sale is planned. That can be computed. And then you should know what your beginning inventory is going to be, because that's coming up on the period. Whatever you're ending up in the prior period, that's going to be your beginning inventory. So if you have these 4 items for planning purchases, you know now that you have to plan on purchasing. You have to plan on purchasing $6,300 of inventory. Now, in some cases, we may have a situation where we have to estimate inventory. It could be a situation, and the one situation, let's say in the middle of a month, we ended up having a fire. And we're not using a perpetual inventory system, we're using the periodic inventory system, which means we end up counting the inventory at the end of the month, but the end of the month never even occurred. We never got there. It was right in the middle of the month where we had a fire. So for insurance purposes, we have to figure out, well, how much do we have in inventory? We weren't keeping track of it. What can we do? So when we're talking about estimating inventory by the gross profit method, this is also known as the gross margin method. And this is often necessary to estimate the value of goods. And the example I gave you is that if a fire was right in the middle of the month, or we hadn't taken an inventory recent, then we're going to be stuck with trying to figure this out. This is widely used to estimate ending inventory, and we rearrange the cost of goods sold model, or the previous formula that we had learned. So how do we do this? Well, we know what our beginning inventory was because we started off with the month fine. We know what we purchased up to the point of the fire, so we end up with the goods available of $20,000. We then can compute we know what we sold from the beginning of the period to the period where we lost all the inventory. We know what we sold at that point in time. And if we use the gross profit method, and what we're going to end up doing is using a percentage. If we use the gross profit percentage method, we can compute what our cost of goods sold should have been. That's why they call this an estimate, because there's no way we could actually tell for sure unless we had the inventory. But if we don't have the inventory, then we can compute what it should have been. And if we compute that our cost of goods sold should have been at $15,000, then we can estimate that the ending inventory was $5,000. We might submit this to an insurance carrier saying, based upon our estimates, this is what we had in inventory at that specific time. So let's look at this example. Suppose a fire destroys some of Under Armour's inventory using the gross profit percentage of 35%. And the question would be, where did it get to 35%? Well, you can do that from historical records. On average, your gross profit percentage has always been 35%. Well, you can assume that that was likely going to be the case when the fire occurred. Under Armour will know what the beginning inventory is. Let's say it's 38,000. They know what their purchases were up until the point of the fire. They purchased $72,000 worth. So the available goods were $110,000. They also know what they sold. Net sales revenue between the period of time where the beginning of the period and the time of the fire, they sold $100,000 worth. So they booked it because that was part of their sales, you know, their revenues, they're generating invoices. They know what they sold it for. So now, based upon that, they can compute what their gross profit should have been given a 35% gross profit margin. Well, 100,000, if their gross profit should have been 35,000, then we take that away from the 100,000. That means their cost of goods sold should have been $65,000. Therefore, if my goods available for sale was 110,000 and I subtract from that the cost of goods sold, it's an estimate, but we subtract the cost of goods sold, then my ending inventory had to be $45,000.